My first question to you is what led you to study and practice international law?
Well, in relation to international law in general, I always found fascinating the idea that you could have law somehow without any kind of overarching mechanism to make it work systematically. The idea of there not being a state with all of its systems which are supposed to be intertwined, and that there could be law as a result, well, in the absence of that, I found fascinating. Um, in relation to international criminal law, I became interested in it, like many do, I suppose, because of a commitment to human rights, a desire to do something which, in some way, made a positive impact through a legal career, and that led, as I said, it does with many people, to study and then to seek work in international criminal law.
Could you describe or could you give us a bit of context in terms of the Sierra Leone Special Court and how that came about and how that ties into the broader international criminal regime?
Well, the Special Court for Sierra Leone is one of several types of international criminal tribunal. They all apply, in substance, a body of law which is similar, but structurally they're very, very different. Before the Special Court existed, there have been, as you'll know, tribunals at Nuremberg and others, and then a long gap before the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. Um, and the Yugoslav Tribunal was set up on the basis of a Security Council resolution, as part of the Security Council's emergency powers, um, as was the Rwandan Tribunal. Now, the Special Court was part of a new type of international criminal tribunal, which is a hybrid tribunal, which is supposed to be partly a domestic institution and partly an international institution. There have been a number of others of those, one of them still running in Cambodia, there's one in East Timor, and one or two others. So that's the type of institution the Special Court is, and that is to be distinguished also from the International Criminal Court, which is a broader treaty-based organisation. Now, the Special Court is also created on the basis of a treaty, but rather than being a treaty which involves many parties, as the Rome Statute for the International Criminal Court does, it's a treaty which is just an agreement between the UN and the state of Sierra Leone.
And now, in terms of the work that you did with Issa Sesay, can you talk to us a bit about who Issa Sesay is and how you came about to work on his defense?
Issa Sesay was the interim leader of the Revolutionary United Front, which is seen to be one of the most significant players in the civil war in Sierra Leone. His role as leader, I say interim leader, he became leader out of a fairly extraordinary set of circumstances at the time which was near the end, or turned out to be near the end, of the war in Sierra Leone. And it came about because of the absence of Fode Sanko, and that story is well known, so I won't sort of rehash it. But Sesay ended up being essentially placed in the role of leader significantly by the international community, with an awful lot of expectations about what he was to do in that context. He was offered certain terms, I suppose you'd put it, in relation to how he would conduct himself in that capacity, which primarily involved bringing an end to the war, or playing a role in ending the war, which he was instrumental in by disarming the RUF. But I must emphasise that if you see photographs or film of Sesay at that time, it looks a little bit absurd. You know, it's a guy dressed up in a huge suit, and he's wearing a suit, put on a platform, saying what he's been told he had to say. At that point, he was a very, very young man, and he looks like a boy having been put onto the platform of someone who had a political stature which he certainly at that time didn't possess. And the scene of him trying to be in control of an organisation like that does look aesthetically rather absurd, and that begins to tell a little bit of a story about the reality, I think, of how much influence he had and how much of a contribution he made to the crimes that occurred in the special court in the that's a Freudian slip there in Sierra Leone during the war.
Now, can you talk a bit more about who Issa Sesay was prior to his indictment? I guess in terms of his, what was his background? Who was he from? I guess.
Well, he was a soldier. He had little or no political experience, in the way I've just described. Right. He spent the majority of the long years of conflict in Sierra Leone living a very kind of transitory lifestyle as part of the RUF, which he'd become part of as a result of having come into contact with Fode Sanko some years before that and having gone abroad and been put through military training. But he saw, I think, the leadership of the RUF at the time that he was recruited as a sort of, almost as having a sort of parental role. And that led him to be a soldier. It was a very, very military background, as I said. And then he was sort of catapulted into this political role, right. Largely due to the influence of the international community very near the end of the war. And in so doing, was told that he would essentially be kept safe by the international community and not prosecuted.
Right. And now, just to pick up on that issue, can you talk a bit more about the defense team itself that you were part of and your role in that context?
Well, it was a very small team. That's the first thing to say. When you compare simply the number of people on it, there were 4 of us against the very large prosecution team. People talk about resources as pertaining to equality of arms as a linchpin to a fair trial, and if that's your barometer, then the Special Court for Sierra Leone is a flawed institution. There's no way to gloss over that. As a member of a defence team, you are an external contractor, whereas the prosecution are employees of the UN, and that's it works out as being another element in this sort of what I perceive to be a structural inequality between the prosecution and the defence in that court.
I wonder if you could talk a bit more about your future plans, and where do you see yourself in the next 2 years, maybe 5 years?
Well, I value hugely the idea of trying to keep a foot in both a theoretical academic world and the world of practice. And in that sense, I very much share the sentiments of the lab here. So with that in mind, I am first of all going to be a visiting researcher at Harvard for the next few months, and I'm going to use that time to reflect on my practical experiences in international tribunals for the last couple of years. Hopefully produce a kind of critical commentary, in particular of the notions of legitimacy which are in play in those contexts. And then after that, to maintain this sort of opposition, this kind of tension, I suppose, between practice and theory, I'm going to go and begin practicing as a barrister in London. In that role, I'll be doing primarily domestic law, a lot of public law and criminal defence, and I'm motivated especially to work in domestic law in the near future, in contrast to my recent experiences in the international field, because it's become very, very apparent to me that a lot of the rhetoric about the usefulness and the functions that international criminal tribunals are supposed to carry out are not entirely realistic in whether or not they can achieve all of the aims that they're supposed to. And for somebody who is motivated by a commitment to human rights a commitment to human rights, I feel that domestic law is a much more realistic avenue through which to pursue the aims of I suppose making some sort of positive difference.